Finn Rizal.
That's me, not Razel.
This can't be right.
When Willow hit theaters in 1988, it wasn't just another fantasy flick. It was George Lucas chasing the dream he scribbled in the 70s, and Ron Howard proving he could command epic spectacle. Behind the dragons and sorcery, the film's journey was filled with battles off-screen, roles lost, romances sparked, and effects invented that would change Hollywood forever. Here are 10 shocking facts you probably missed about Willow, the underdog fantasy that refused to disappear. Before Willow, Warwick Davis was best known as Wicket the Ewok, hidden beneath layers of fur and latex in Return of the Jedi. At just 17, he was cast as Willow Ufgood, finally revealing his own face and voice to audiences worldwide. Carrying an entire fantasy epic was no small task, but Davis proved he could anchor a blockbuster. This role changed his career trajectory forever, elevating him from background creature to leading man. In the early 1970s, George Lucas drafted a fantasy about little people titled Munchkins. Hollywood wasn't ready, so it sat in a drawer. Everything changed when he saw 11-year-old Davis on Return of the Jedi. Lucas rewrote his idea into Willow, building the role specifically around Davis. He didn't audition dozens of actors, he tailored the story for one. The film existed because Lucas saw Davis's spark and wanted him as the heart of the narrative. Ron Howard was fresh off Cocoon, an Oscar-winning but grounded sci-fi drama. Willow was an enormous leap. Sprawling battles, hundreds of extras, magical creatures, and experimental effects. Filming across continents nearly overwhelmed him, but it also transformed his career. The project proved he could handle ambitious, effects-driven storytelling, preparing him for films like Apollo 13 and The Da Vinci Code. Howard himself admitted Willow was the turning point where he became fearless as a director. George Lucas always loved underdog stories. Luke Skywalker versus the Empire, teens rebelling in American graffiti. With Willow, he literalized the idea. The hero wasn't just underestimated, he was physically smaller than everyone around him. Willow Ufgood was mocked, dismissed, and doubted. Yet he rose to protect Elora Danan and defeat Bav Morda. Casting Davis wasn't just clever, it embodied the story's theme. Willow worked because victory came from someone who wasn't expected to win at all. Mad Martigan became one of Val Kilmer's most iconic roles, a swaggering swordsman equal parts rogue and clown, but it almost went to John Cusack. He auditioned at the height of his rising career, convinced the role would be his breakthrough. Losing to Kilmer stung for years. Kilmer's wild humor and charm defined the film, making the part unforgettable. For Cusack, it was the one that got away. For Kilmer, it was destiny fulfilled. Keep watching, the next one is even crazier. The climax was supposed to feature a terrifying dragon rivaling anything in Star Wars. Instead, the effects collapsed. Miniatures and compositing made the monster look awkward and toy-like, quickly nicknamed the two-headed iguana by crew members. What should have been breathtaking instead looked clumsy, undercutting the film's finale. Fans remember the dragon more for its flaws than its menace. It's proof that even George Lucas-backed effects could misfire, leaving behind camp instead of cinematic spectacle. Behind the fantasy, the set was grueling. Stunt coordinator Vic Armstrong admitted battle scenes sometimes grew dangerously sloppy. Real weapons mixed with rubber props, extras swung too hard, and armor occasionally cracked. Even Warwick Davis, still a teenager, remembered being thrown into mud, fire, and chaos. At least one actor left with stitches. On screen, it looked like magical triumph. Off-screen, it was bruises, exhaustion, and the painful cost of creating epic spectacle. To capture a truly epic feel, Willow wasn't confined to a single studio. It spanned England's Elstree stages, the valleys of Wales, and the snowbound mountains of New Zealand, years before Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings. For Davis, still a teenager, the whirlwind of global travel was overwhelming. Cast and crew battled jet lag, climate extremes, and endless reshoots. The results looked spectacular, but the reality was fatigue, mud, and months of relentless dislocation. Comic relief characters Kevin Pollak and Rick Overton played brownies, but filming them was no joke. Every scene required blue screen work, with shots painstakingly composited to match the human cast. Their stride, rhythm, and timing often looked off, forcing frame-by-frame corrections. Entire sequences had to be rebuilt in post-production. Audiences laughed at the slapstick, but the crew nearly lost their minds. The smallest characters turned into the biggest technical challenge of the entire movie. Before the film even hit theaters, its own trailer sparked ridicule. Critics mocked its pacing, called the effects unfinished, and labeled the story derivative. Executives panicked, fearing disaster before release. George Lucas stood firm, trusting the film would prove itself. When Willow premiered, audiences embraced it, overturning early doubts. The preview was a curse, the movie itself the antidote. It's a reminder that first impressions can nearly doom a film before it begins. Next up, the secrets only insiders noticed. Don't miss it. On paper, Mad Martigan and Saoirse barely connected. She was Bavmorda's daughter, and he was a rogue caught in chains. Their romance felt like a convenience more than a heartbeat of the film. But on set, Ron Howard noticed sparks. Val Kilmer and Joanne Whalley lit up every shared scene. Their banter sizzled, their glances lingered, and the chemistry was undeniable. Howard reshaped dialogue to lean into it, allowing romance to grow organically. What began as improvisation became a love story that transformed the film's emotional center. Off-camera, that magic didn't stop. Kilmer and Whalley married a year later. Their fairy tale began in a fantasy epic, showing sometimes movie chemistry doesn't fade when the credits roll. The monstrous dragon-like beast in Willow wasn't pulled from folklore, but from George Lucas's sharp wit. Named Eborsisk, it was a jab at critics Gene Siskel and Roger Ebert, who had lambasted Lucas's earlier works. Lucas, rather than avoid the sting of their reviews, immortalized them as a snarling, awkward creature. Every time audiences saw the beast shriek, they were unknowingly watching a parody of Lucas's greatest detractors. It was petty, playful, and strangely satisfying. By naming a fantasy monster after the duo, Lucas ensured their names would forever live in infamy, not as revered film critics, but as cinematic slime. For Lucas, it was part joke, part revenge, and ultimately one of the cheekiest Easter eggs in the entire movie. George Lucas's first notes for the project described it as Munchkins, shorthand for a fantasy story centered on little people. But as production grew, the name felt wrong. The Wizard of Oz had already immortalized the word, and in many circles, it was used dismissively. With one of the largest casts of little people ever assembled in a Hollywood film, Lucas wanted a title that gave dignity rather than novelty. So, the project was renamed Willow, placing its hero's name front and center. Suddenly, the film wasn't about spectacle or gimmicks. It was about a man, a farmer, and a father thrust into greatness. That shift gave the narrative humanity, grounding epic fantasy in something simple, personal, and unforgettable. When Finn Raziel flickers through animals before reclaiming her human form, audiences in 1988 gasped. They weren't watching stop-motion or makeup tricks. They were witnessing the very first use of digital morphing. Industrial light and magic pioneered the technology for Willow, melting one image seamlessly into another. At the time, nothing like it had ever been attempted. Critics called it sorcery, and filmmakers took notice. The innovation became a foundation for later blockbusters, from Terminator 2 to Jurassic Park. With a single transformation sequence, Willow pushed cinema into a new era. The moment wasn't just magical on screen, it rewrote the language of visual effects, proving fantasy could innovate as boldly as science fiction. A spell, once cast, spread everywhere. The soul of Willow lies not only in its characters or magic, but in James Horner's soaring score. Already celebrated for Aliens and Star Trek II, Horner leaned into Celtic inspiration, pipes, flutes, and drums echoing through villages and battlefields. His music turned pastoral scenes into something timeless and gave battles a pulse of grandeur. Even critics who dismissed the film admitted the soundtrack was extraordinary, praising it as one of Horner's most moving works. For fans, the score became inseparable from the story itself, replayed on vinyl, CD, and streaming decades later. In many ways, the true magic wasn't visual at all, it was symphonic, flowing under every spell and sword clash. Keep watching. What follows changed Hollywood forever. Willow carried a hefty $35 million budget, a massive gamble for fantasy in 1988. It earned $137 million worldwide, respectable yet far from a blockbuster. Released against sequels like Rambo 3 and Crocodile Dundee 2, the film was overshadowed. Critics called its box office middling proof that fantasy remained a risky bet, yet time reshaped its reputation. VHS rentals, cable reruns, and streaming revived its following. Fans quoted lines, passed it down to kids, and celebrated its quirks. What once felt like underperformance slowly transformed into a cult classic. The numbers didn't crown it victorious, but its endurance made it something rarer, a beloved survivor that refused to fade into obscurity. The 1980s were flooded with ambitious fantasy epics: Labyrinth, Legend, The Dark Crystal, Krull. Studios banked on magic to win audiences, but profits rarely followed. By the time Willow released in 1988, fatigue had set in. Audiences preferred action blockbusters, sequels, and familiar brands. Willow was meant to prove fantasy still had box office power. Instead, it landed in the middle, admired, remembered, but not triumphant. Hindsight, however, softened the judgment. Fans now group Willow with those cult fantasies that defined the decade's creative ambition, even if they stumbled commercially. It was both a finale and a milestone, the end of one Hollywood gamble and the beginning of another era in epic storytelling. Despite its struggles, Willow made waves at the 61st Academy Awards. It earned 2 nominations, Best Sound Editing and Best Visual Effects, thanks largely to its groundbreaking digital morphing sequence. For many in Hollywood, the nominations validated the film's ambition, even if critics remained divided. Yet when envelopes opened, Willow lost both categories to Who Framed Roger Rabbit, itself a revolutionary blend of animation and live action. Lucas's film walked away empty-handed, but history remembers it differently. Its innovations continued to ripple through cinema, inspiring new effects pipelines. Awards fade, but influence lingers, and Willow's morphing sorcery remains one of the most important leaps in film technology. Even if box office glory eluded it, Willow became a franchise in miniature. Marvel Comics released a 3-issue adaptation, allowing fans to relive the story in bold panels. Capcom crafted a Willow video game for the NES, combining action RPG mechanics with familiar characters, echoing the style of The Legend of Zelda. An arcade brawler followed, letting players hack through trolls and sorcery long after the film's theatrical run. Toys, books, and merchandise kept its world alive. For some, these tie-ins were the first doorway into Willow's universe. The movie wasn't just a film, it became a cultural ecosystem, proving even a modest hit could spark lasting imagination across mediums. George Lucas envisioned Willow as the first chapter in a trilogy. Sequels would follow Elora Danan as she grew into her prophecy as Empress, with Willow and Mad Martigan returning to guide her. But Hollywood works on numbers, not dreams. With only modest profits, sequels never materialized. Fans instead got continuation through novels co-written with X-Men writer Chris Claremont, Shadow Moon, Shadow Dawn, Shadow Star. For decades, that was all. Then, more than 30 years later, Disney Plus revived Willow as a streaming series, with Warwick Davis returning. The trilogy Lucas dreamed of never reached theaters, but the prophecy survived, reborn for a new generation. Willow wasn't just a fantasy film, it was a legacy of courage, innovation, and underdogs proving themselves against doubt. It reshaped technology, launched careers, and became a cult classic that still resonates decades later. Its lessons of bravery and resilience endure far beyond the screen. Keep the adventure alive by continuing straight into the next video.